All right, we're recording. I do have one other announcement for you guys, which is, it's not really an announcement. There's two things I'd like you to kind of keep in mind as we do this. One is that the shop has been getting really filthy, which, I mean, not a surprise. It's a wood shop. It gets really filthy. I would like it, though, if you start being a little more conscientious about cleaning up after yourself at the end of class. Maybe don't work all the way through until the very last minute, but stop 10 minutes out and do some cleanup, which involves sweeping mostly. I went through the machine room yesterday and did a pretty major pickup of like tools and things that were sitting out, but I didn't have much of an opportunity to kind of clean. So I would like it if we do that a little more, just a little more intentionally and a little more conscientiously as the weeks go on. After this project is done, if we have enough time built into the schedule, we'll have one shop cleanup day. And we do a big formal shop cleanup right at the end of the semester during finals week. But depending on how bad it gets throughout the semester, if we have that time built in, which we may or may not because we have the snow week, we might have a shop cleanup day. So just be aware that that's a thing. Secondly, and this is not to scold at all, but I am noticing, I've been here a lot outside of class time working on my own stuff, and I am not seeing you guys in here. I'm seeing my advanced students a lot. I want to remind you of what I said at the very beginning of the semester about how much time this takes. I am not seeing enough time at this juncture for you all to get your projects done on time. So I know you have outside work, I know there are essays, I know there are research projects, I know there's a ton of other stuff going on, but please, 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 now, starting this week, preferably even starting today, you guys have to spend more time outside of class in here, or you are not going to get your work done, or you're not going to get it done well. So that goes for everybody. Some of you are in a better place than others, but everybody needs to really turn up the heat on this, okay? Especially too, considering that there's only one of me, and the closer we get to a due date, the less friendly I am about helping people outside of class time. Which, that sounds meh, that sounds bad. But it's one of those things where if it's the night before it's due and I'm here outside of class, it's probably not to help you, it's to work on my own stuff, and then I'll be like, why are you bothering me on a Saturday? And anyway, pretend I didn't say that. I'm nicer than that. I'm so much nicer than that, oh my God. Anyway, you get the point. Questions about anything before we go forward?
What time do the machines turn off again?
Like 12:30.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I mean, they're on until pretty late. And remember too, like, there are other things you can be doing after that point, like sanding, for example, or gluing something up, or, carving, all of that good stuff. A lot of people ask, do I have to have a partner if I'm just sanding? And the answer really is yes. You guys are intro. You have to have a partner. But remember, advanced kids are your partner too. You don't have to have somebody who's like there to hold your hand and make sure everything's okay. You just have to have somebody who can call 911 if necessary. So, if there's somebody in the other room, ask them how long they'll be there for. And say, well, I'm going to be in the other room. Could you let me know before you go, whatever, I need a partner. I mean, they know how that works. Coolio? All right, let's talk about sanding. Sanding. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So, sanding is the first part of this two-part process of making your things look amazing at the end, right? Your stuff comes off of the machines, it looks meh, right? Tends to have those really fine parallel lines on them from the in-feed rollers or from the blades passing over them. I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again, that is one of the things that I'm looking for when it comes to like quality craftsmanship, is that I don't see any of that. It drives me crazy actually when I'm seeing other manufactured things where they just sort of left that there. And I'm like, joiner marks all over the whole thing. I hate it. Makes me nuts. we're in a relationship with this material in this situation, right? And we want to make it as pretty and beautiful as possible. So we're going to spend some time giving it a makeover after it has gone through the machines to bring out its glorious possibilities. And the best way to do that is with sanding. So in addition to those little surfaces, or all those variations, this has probably just been damaged by handling and like all this other stuff. It won't necessarily be like super obvious, but as you're sanding it, it will become much more so. You'll be like, oh, there's a scratch in that. That's not cool. So anyway, what is your equipment? This is where your towels come in really handy. If you have not brought in a towel yet, I really strongly encourage you to do so. There are a few kicking around, and if it's out, it's probably fair game. So you can just sort of help yourself to whatever. I keep the stack on top of the blue cart there. You'll notice that there's none sitting there right now. That's because I've got 2 of them in play at the moment for demo. One, and there's one in the other room that I'm going to show you guys. But it's really, really helpful. You see how when I do this, it already is like releasing sawdust into the air. This guy is going to catch most of the sawdust as I'm sanding. So I can take this outside at the end of class and I can shake it out, and instead of all of it becoming airborne, most of it's going to fall into this and be trapped. It's a wonderful thing. And we're all wearing masks these days, but back in the before times, you could really F up your lungs really good. Just, wood in particular is a pretty nasty irritant to your lungs. And a lot of people have discovered that they have a minor or major allergy to basswood in particular. And when you get it in there, it hurts. It hurts, dear Lord. So anyway, the other function of this towel is to protect your project. If you're laying something out and you sand it and then you flip it over and you sand some more and you pick it up again, if there's something on this tabletop, glue, whatever, you're going to damage the crap out of your board. And I know I've mentioned this before, but this is important enough that I'm mentioning it a second time. So this is piece of equipment number 1. Before you start doing any of your sanding, you're going to want to make sure that you've got that ready to go. But let's talk about sandpaper. Sandpaper. So sandpaper is an art cash item that I have for sale for you guys. It's real cheap. It's 50 cents a sheet. Extremely inexpensive. And from each sheet, I think, is 9 by 12, 9 by 11, something like that. It's made by a company called Klingspor, K-L-I-N-G-S-P-O-R. They make fabulous abrasives. This is the standard that everybody uses who I know who's a professional woodworker. Everybody uses Klingspor. Partly because it's such a consistent product, like you're going to get the same size grain all the way across, but also because it's extremely long lasting. So much so that I have a giant box in the tool room of scrap sandpaper, which you guys have probably seen, of stuff that's mostly dead, but not entirely, that people put in there because it's still good. Generally, yeah, it probably is still good. It stays good for a really long time. To the point, in fact, that you guys probably will only need to buy 1 sheet of each grit for the semester. Legit. Unless you do a ton of sanding. You might need to buy 2 of the coarsest grits, kind of a thing. But, we provide quality for you for a reason. And at 50 cents a sheet, it's a steal. So if you need sandpaper, you can help yourself. It is in my office. You just go into my office. The sheets are on the right-hand side, close to the door into the scary office inside there. And the discs, if you're going to use the disc sander, or the random orbital, is right to the, it's behind the door when you go in there. Help yourself, but record what you take in the book with a little hatch mark. For example, I will be recording what I have taken for demo in the little book and be like, all right, here it is, yay. Anyway, so sandpaper. We have in sheet form a whole array, starting at my lowest grit that I offer in sheet is 100. And from there goes 100, 150, 180, 220, 320, 400, 600, 800. That's what those three are. Now what does that mean? Anybody? Anyone want to tell me what they think that has a correlation to? I know I told you already. Just like, I know.
Not gonna say it.
No, Colby just raised his hand. Colby, what is it?
Isn't it that like the smaller the grid, it's the less material it's taking off?
There is that, but how does that number correspond with that?
I don't really know.
That's okay.
It's the number of particles in a square inch.
Yeah, in a square area there. So, you know, I don't know that it's a square inch. That I think is me being nuts. But if you think about it, if you've got a single size unit and there are, let's say there's 100 pieces of grit in there that fill it completely, they're going to be much larger than, say, the 300 pieces of grit that fill it on a finer sheet of sandpaper. Does that make sense? So it corresponds with however many you can fit of it in a single unit. It's a bad explanation, but I think it kind of makes sense. What that means, though, is that the lower the number is, the coarser the grit. The higher the number is, the finer the grit. The finest one I offer is 800. In woodworking, we don't tend to go too much higher than that. And even then, we don't really do it with the wood. We do it with, you know, finish as we're, you know, refining the things that we're putting on top. Sorry, brain fart. Woo, 8 a.m. 8 a.m. So tired. But anyway, so what that means is that my 100 grit is my coarsest, right? You can kind of see. The nice thing too about sandpaper, unlike, you know, some other cutting tools like files and stuff, is that it really is multi-directional. I can sand in, you know, multiple directions because it doesn't have like a grain. It's just a thing, right? So this is my coarsest grit that I've got here. I use anything from 100 grit down to 320 on wood. This is worth writing down. Yes, you all should be taking notes very actively, not sort of whenever. 100 grit's the coarsest. I will work through maybe until 320. I only use 320 when I'm working with material that is extremely hard. If you think about it, the harder the material, the more it's going to want to polish up, right? You'll be able to refine it smoother and smoother and smoother. For the most part, you don't need to sand your wood past 220. So, in addition to that, some people ask, well, can I skip a grit? The answer is no. Just like with the cutting tools, where you start with the most aggressive and you work your way down to the least aggressive, you have to kind of step it down. You can't just start right off the machines and say, oh, this looks pretty good, and go to 220 and say, it's pretty. The thing is that you will have probably smoothed out your surface, but you won't have gotten rid of any of the tooling or any of the other imperfections that are in there, right? So you have to start at 100 and you have to work your way down. 100, 150, 180, 200. That's not really a negotiable thing. The only exception to that is if you are working with something that's so soft that taking it to 220 wouldn't be smart. Like for those of you who are using basswood, for example, if you're going to paint your basswood when you're done, sanding it to 220 actually doesn't do it much good because the basswood is so soft. The difference between 180 and 220 is extremely little. The harder the material, the higher you can sand it. It's more like, I know I just said this, more like polishing a stone. You can take a stone and you can polish it up really shiny. Well, you can do the same thing with wood. Also, like I said, the 400, 600, and 800 are used to refine finishes. If I'm putting polyurethane on this when it's done, the polyurethane dries, it's hardened, whatever. I have to flatten it after that. Believe it or not, you don't just apply finish and call it good. You apply finish and then you refine the finish to make it look good. It's not just this, simple matter of sticking something on there and calling it awesome. So that's what those are typically used for, is for flattening and refining finishes even further. Occasionally, if you've got a piece of something that's extremely hard, like the Bubinga that's in there, or maybe, no, the Bubinga is really the hardest one. You can actually sand it up to 400, just the wood, and have it continue to get better and better looking. It's not one of these things that has diminishing returns, but it's because it's so hard. I would never do that with oak. I wouldn't do that with any of the other woods, maple, walnut, whatever. All right, questions so far? All right, for this first project, pretty much every one of you is going to be sanding by hand, as opposed to doing machine sanding. Your second project, you will be probably using one of the other sanders, which I'm going to get to after I demo this. And the reason's pretty straightforward. You are all working with big blocks, essentially. Big blocks where the grain runs in the same direction through the entire thing, right? That said, it's pretty easy to figure out how you're going to need to do your sanding. Because the big thing that dictates this whole thing is that you have to sand with the grain. Surprise, surprise. Sand along the grain. But that's the big important one here, right? Oh, it's the worst chalk in the world. Sand with the grain. That might seem really obvious, but you'd be really surprised that how not obvious that is. What do I mean by with the grain? I mean that if the grain is running along the length of a piece, I am sanding along the length of the piece in a flat motion. I'm not sanding in a circle. I'm not sanding diagonally. I'm not cutting across for any reason, any of that. What sanding is actually doing is deliberately and intentionally damaging the surface in a controlled way, if that makes sense. You've got, if you think about the nature of the surface, here's, I'm going to blow up the wood big time here. This is the end of your board, right? And if you're looking at it closely, you've got all of these fibers, right, that are laid this way next to one another. But at the end, they kind of look like this. And then the fibers run a long way. When you go to sand, you're kind of effing up this surface. But you're doing it in such a way that those fibers are kind of getting scratched and broken down so that they look all identical. And generally speaking, what you're going to do is then take off anything that's high. If there's a little dent in there or whatever, or a deeper scratch, you're actually scratching all of the way back down to that thing. You're sanding down to it. I realize this seems probably pretty obvious, or it seems like it should be intuitive, but understanding what sanding actually does helps you to be a better sander. So you're scratching the surface. And what it leaves behind is, something that, and I'm exaggerating obviously, is really deep but really consistent scratches, right? All the way across. And then when you switch to your next sanding grid, that might make it so that it's more consistent like that. See that? Still lots of scratches in it. But as you go, it essentially doubles all that. It eventually gets down to the point where those ridges in there are virtually indistinguishable. Does that make sense why that would be? But that's also why you don't go across, because instead of those grits working their way in between the fibers, they tear across their faces and damages the wood more. At which point in time, it's really hard to get those marks out. So, that's the basic concept. How do we do it? Well, we do it real simply. First and foremost, you need to have something firm and flat to back your sandpaper with. You never want to sand just with your hand and some sandpaper. Your hand is soft, even though it doesn't seem like it necessarily. If you were to just take some sandpaper and sand like this, you're going to round something over or otherwise distort it. Even if it's not super noticeable, it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen, no matter what. So starting with something flat and hard is the perfect thing to do. I have this little block right here. You see it's got my name on it. That has been made out of several layers of plywood and has a piece of linoleum actually glued to its surface here. It is the perfect size to accommodate half the length of a piece of sandpaper. I would suggest digging around through the like scrap plywood bin and maybe getting yourself a piece of scrap plywood, like that one, for example. How's that working for you?
I think it's working well.
There you go. You can cut it off shorter if you need to on the chop saw, sand the edges to be the right size, you know, all that good stuff. But, you know, have yourself a merry little sanding block. And when I say flat too, I'm not talking about a surface that came off the bandsaw. That's not flat. That has a texture to it. I'm talking about something that is dead flat, okay? So what do? The other thing is that I don't just use either an entire sheet of sandpaper or tear off little pieces. Tearing off little pieces I start to do when the sandpaper is at the very end of its life and it doesn't need my love anymore. As it is, I divide this into like really usable parts. Typically speaking, back in the day, we would just quarter these because there were sanders that were called quarter sheet sanders and half sheet sanders. This, for example, is a half sheet sander. It needs a little love at the moment, but if you were to tear a sheet of sandpaper in half the long way, I could strap it on here, and then this thing would essentially vibrate, and I'd be able to sand with it. However, I divide these into 6 instead of into 4. The reason being that I find that if I use it as a quarter sheet, I'm only ever using like the center of the quarter because the other parts of it are wrapped around the block. So much so that I don't find it usable. And you can rotate it and do whatever, but it just, I don't know. To me it sucks. I don't do it. Here's how you divide up your sheet of sandpaper. Please do not use scissors. Let me repeat that. Please do not use scissors. This thing will self-perforate if you do it the right way. Observe. I'm going to fold it in half with the smooth sides facing. And I'm going to take my block and just press that down. I'm going to invert it. Do the same thing. Look at that. It sort of tears itself apart because it has the sand on it already, right? What is that sound? No? They're just messing with me. They're like, Sarah's trying to teach. Anyway, from here you have those 2 options. You can either fold that in half to make a quarter sheet, which is perfectly fine. Some people have bigger hands, and frankly, working with a quarter sheet works better for them. Like I said, I have slightly smaller hands, got tiny little mitts, and therefore I find thirds to be best. But all I do is I divide this into thirds. And lots of practice. Look at that. Could that be more perfect? The answer is no. Woo, lots of practice. Incidentally, you're also going to want to put your name on the back of your sandpaper just because you're paying for it and it's a commodity. So write your name on the back of it so somebody doesn't walk off with it thinking it's theirs. But again, same thing. Oh, look. There it is. And for me, this is the perfect size to just wrap around with about 1 centimeter of material on either side. I'm trying to do it in air so you can see it, but I should just do it like that. See? And the idea is that you hold the sandpaper on the block and then you work. But again, I have small fingers, so I can get my hands around this and hold on to it without too much difficulty. If this were bigger, it would come up the sides higher, and then I would be able to put my fingers on it higher that way too. Make sense? Yes? All right. So how does this work? When you are sanding, you are really actively working. This should make you tired, as much as I hate to say that. This is one of the more labor-intensive parts of woodworking. So stand up, don't sit. Sitting and sanding is actually more work because your arms are going to be out here instead of down here. So you're like, yeah, okay. Ooh, you're going to end up with a crick in your neck really fast. So instead, the thing I make sure that I'm doing is that I'm constantly working away from myself, like straight out. Not across, but straight. The reason for that is that the motion is much more consistent. If I try sanding this way, I'm going to sand in an arc every time. And I'm going to leave behind marks that don't do me any favors, right? So here's my piece. On something like this, I usually do sort of 2/3 of it so that I can hang on to the piece, and then I flip it around and I do the other end. Instead of trying to either do the whole thing or whatever. All right, so here we go. You'll also notice that I'm holding my block diagonally. That's partly to maximize the amount of the surface that's in contact here. Why not make it go fast? You can see there's a lot of dust falling off already. You're going to want to watch your paper for clogging. That's another thing that the towel is really good for. I can just kind of smack it a little bit and it comes off. So you need to spend the most time at your lowest grit. You're going to spend a lot of time at 100, right? If you haven't gotten a flaw out at the 100 grit level, it's going to still be there as you move further down. It's not going to come out as you keep going. You got to get this perfect and neutral first. A lot of people ask, well, how do you know? How do you know when you're ready to move up to the next grit? And that's a hard question. Because to an extent, you could keep going at that grit kind of forever and not really notice too much of a difference. For myself, I look for two things. One, I tip my work in the light and I want to see how consistent it is. If it looks really, really the same, that's a good indicator. It's also an issue of feel, honestly. At some point, it's going to feel like you're just not doing anything anymore. Like, At first, it really feels like you're moving a lot of material, and then at some point, it's going to seem like you're just, it's going to start to feel like you're polishing it instead of like you're sanding it. It's super, super subtle, but it becomes much more noticeable as you go up through the grits. But that is the point at which I'd switch up and take it to the next level. So I can feel this as I'm going, that I've already sanded back here and I haven't up here. The surface feels different as I sand over it. It takes a fair bit of practice and paying close attention to what you're doing to be able to feel that. So you might also say to yourself, but Sarah, how do I sand something wider than this? This is really easy because it's the width. It's fully contained within my sanding block, right? It's harder when it's wider, of course, because you would probably say, but Sarah, you said to just move straight back and forth and not diagonally at all. It becomes a very tight scrubbing motion, so that as you're going back and forth, or forward and back, you're also moving back and forth. You can see how I'm moving my arm very subtly as I go. It shouldn't be any kind of big thing. If you're leaving behind diagonal marks, you're going to have a hard time getting them out. So that's how you do that. But now I'm going to show you a trick. A Mick Cheaterton trick that is so awesome. It's going to save you so much time. Dear God. And it's a trick involving knives. Woo! You're going to notice in the tool room, in the drawer that says knives and scissors, there are several packages of utility knife blades. In woodworking, traditionally, there's several different ways that you can approach finishing a surface. One of them is, of course, abrading, which is what sanding is. Cutting is the other one. Shearing the surface in such a fine way that it's actually slicing the fibers, that is sort of the ultimate in a beautiful finish. Frankly, we don't really have the equipment to do that well, and it takes a ton of practice. But what we do have is this cheater method right here, which is I'm going to use my utility knife blade as a scraper, and I am going to shear off those high points. So holding my blade straight up and down like this, more or less. I sometimes put a little bit of flex in it to keep it from chattering. Do you see how much dust that alone is producing? And I'm being careful of my ends. But in between sanding, typically I scrape. This has two benefits. It makes those peaks that I was talking about, it knocks them down. So I'm already at an advantage when I go to that next sanding grit. What it also does is it makes my surface all of a sudden much clearer. So if there is anything that I have to sand out before I go to my next grit, it's going to become visible all of a sudden. It's awesome. It's awesome. You have to be careful, of course. It's a utility knife blade. It is sharp. But just by sanding or scraping this a little bit, and you can scrape diagonally. That's a nice thing. You don't have to, you should always scrape with the grain, but if you're kind of going diagonally with the grain, you can do that. Oh, look at that. That's with 100 grit and scraping. That should not be as shiny and beautiful as it is. after 100 grit. But it is because the razor blade. I can see though that I've got a spot right here that's a little cloudy yet. So I'm going to need to spend a little more time with it. The wood that I'm using, incidentally, is something called Sapele. It is pretty hard. This is going to be one of those woods that will take a polish pretty nicely. So, frankly, the harder the wood, the more it responds well to scraping as well. So yeah, this is what I would do: is I would go 100, scrape, 150, scrape, etc., 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 until I went all the way through everything. At the end of that process, when I've got all my pieces and everything looks good, the last thing I want to do, assuming that my object is ready for finish at this point, it doesn't need to be assembled into something else, is I'm going to chamfer my edges. So you'll notice that rule number 3 here of my irrevocable list of woodworking rules is always chamfer your edges. What that means, and we talked about this again, I've mentioned it before, but it's super important, it's on the list, is that you need to relieve the harshness of those transitional sides. You can get a paper cut really easily from the corners of your blocks because they're sharp. And especially if you're gonna like refine those edges or those faces, those transitions are gonna become even more gnarly. So all you do to chamfer your edges, so you take some sandpaper. I usually use something finer, like the 180, 220, as opposed to the 100. And I'm not trying to round it. I'm just trying to relieve the harshness of that edge. And so I'm going to do it right here. Just a couple free passes to make it. See that? It just puts this tiny bevel on there. And it doesn't make it look less square or less clean, but it makes it a hell of a lot easier to touch and to handle. See that? So it does not matter what you're working on. You want your edges chamfered. It puts a nice sort of finishing touch on everything visually, and then physically makes it easier to handle. If we were still in the days of touching these things, I would have passed this around and you could feel the difference between, you know, the one side and the other. All right, so that's how you do flat things. A lot of you aren't going to be dealing with flat things. Many of you are going to be dealing with things that have curves and end grain and all that good stuff. In those situations, you should think about your wood almost like it has a North Pole and a South Pole. And those poles are the end grain, right? Let's say we're talking about the little dragon thing over here, right? It's a really bad drawing, but you get the idea. Christian's working on a little dragon dude that's going to be made out of a solid block. And, you know, grain's going to run this way through it. But all of this is end grain. This is end grain, this is end grain. Let's see, let's draw all of the exposed end grain, shall we? That, and that, and that. It's a lot. Right? So how do you deal with that? It really depends on the circumstance. The rest of the object should kind of tell you how you should sand it. Like, for example, if you have just like a straight up box, right? Like, Emma, Emma? Yes. Woo, I'm so bad with names. I'm so sorry. I know we're like into the semester. It's just a thing. And especially now that I can't see your friggin' faces, it's extra bad. but like if you have a box that's just like a solid block, for example, and the sides are being sanded with the grain, it makes sense to just sort of turn the corner. So you go this way, and then across the end grain, and then back down. You know what I'm saying? It's just a sensible extension of what that form should be. But on something like this, well, okay, well you're going to sand the faces of it this way, right? So a sensible extension of that is to kind of keep sanding in that same direction over the end grain, right? Almost like you're polishing it, but not quite. But if I'm going to sand this way here, I'm just going to kind of curve around and connect it to the backside that way. Fortunately, the other thing that works extremely well with end grain, but it takes forever, be forewarned, is scraping. Like not scraping and sanding, just scraping. The more you scrape something, the darker it's going to appear, because instead of having a cloudy scratched surface, it's going to be a progressively cleaner cut surface. It's beautiful when it's done well. So scraping end grain, the other thing about that is it reveals the scratches that are in it like crazy. Remember, end grain is harder than face grain. Again, I've mentioned that before, but like that's a fact that has been employed in printmaking for hundreds of years. Like wood engravings are done in the end grain of cherry because it holds so much detail. That tells you something. If it holds detail, it means it also holds damage. So sanding end grain is a real pain in the tuchus. Be forewarned, the thing. Yeah, so it ends up just kind of being like, well, how do I extend the path of what I've already done to make that look good? Make sense? Yeah? All right, I have one more example I want to show you guys. It's in the other room, so if you want to bring your notebooks and pencils.